Henry VIII is known to be one of history's most evil monarchs, and especially as one of the most notorious English kings. His relationship and subsequent marriages to 6 women have made him one of the most interesting, polarising and brutal kings. Today, thousands of tourists flock to England to understand the logic behind the rather violent king, and to hear tales of those who crossed Henry, most of who ended up at the block, being barbarically executed. Today we're going to look at one of Henry's most despicable episodes, and the downfall of his second queen, Anne Boleyn. I'm sure you're aware that Anne and Henry's relationship initially caused chaos in the aftermath of Henry's break from Rome. However, what was even more scandalous was the end of their marriage. It would lead to the execution of the Queen, but also would lead to the brutal and horrific executions of 5 innocent men who history has forgotten. So join us today as we look at the Boleyn executions, the murders of the men accused of high treason and adultery with Anne Boleyn. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Following the death of Henry's first wife Catherine of Aragon, the king and his new Queen Anne were overjoyed. Anne Boleyn had become Henry's second wife in hugely controversial circumstances. The Pope would not grant Henry a divorce from Catherine, so decided to split from the church, greatly angering Catholics inside England and also around the world. In fact, there were even fears of a great Catholic invasion in England from the Spanish and the Holy Roman Empire. One of Henry's biggest quests was that he needed a male heir to succeed him, and this drive would also lead to the downfall of Anne. After Anne's coronation, she gave birth to a girl named Elizabeth, who would later go on to be Elizabeth I, but this birth was a blow to Henry, who expected a son. In the Christmas of 1534, Anne would have a stillbirth, and would in October of 1535 become pregnant again. At this time, Anne was aware of the dangers if she failed to provide Henry with a son that he greatly craved. During her pregnancy, Henry VIII would be unhorsed in a tournament and was knocked out for 2 hours. The great worry and panic is believed to have led to Anne's miscarriage, which occurred 5 days after this incident. Another possible cause of her miscarriage is believed to be the shock that Anne had when he saw Jane Seymour sat on her husband Henry's lap, and the rage that she then built. Because of Henry's desperate quest for a son, the tragic nature of Anne's pregnancies led the king to become tired and frustrated with his queen. His eye would quickly wander towards Jane Seymour, who would then become his new mistress. It's considered that Anne's fall from grace was engineered by Thomas Cromwell. However, Anne would be detained and held prisoner inside the Tower of London. Cromwell would help to perpetuate accusations of adultery against Anne to the king, but it was the king himself who issued the instructions as to what to do with Anne. There were a number of false charges which were levelled at the Queen, including adultery, incest and conspiracy. The ridiculous trial that Anne would have would eventually result in her death and beheading. However, what isn't mostly told is the story of the 5 men who were accused of having relations with the Queen. The allegations levelled were completely shocking, and would also lead to the barbaric beheading of 5 innocent men and members of Henry's royal court. All of these 5 men would be executed at Tower Hill in London, outside the Tower of London, on the 17th of May 1536. One man accused of treason along with Anne was George Boleyn, the brother. George would become a courtier and would play a prominent role in the politics of the early 1530s. He was introduced to Henry VIII's court at the age of 10 when he attended a Christmas party, and he must have impressed the king, becoming one of Henry's page boys. When he was older, he would become Henry's esquire of the body, a rather prestigious job in which they were responsible for dressing the king, and George would also become the master of the Buckhounds in 1528 and would oversee a royal hunting party. He would be an important member of the court, having good relations with international politicians, and George would welcome them into Henry's court. Following Anne's final miscarriage, Cromwell and Henry would devise a plot that would see George charged with incest with the Queen, also his sister, and he was also charged with planning to kill the king. He would be arrested on the 2nd of May 1536, a day after he was a celebrity jouster at a May Day festival. George stood trial a few hours after his sister Anne on Monday the 15th of May. He and Anne would be tried separately to the other men accused. Anne had been already found guilty, and because of this he was prejudged, as if his sister was guilty, then he must have been, in the eyes of the ridiculous judges, also guilty. The trial had been arranged to ensure that the charges levelled against George couldn't fail. There was no evidence of incest with the Queen and George. George's wife throughout history has been accused of providing evidence to support the king's claim, but this is unlikely to be true. The majority of the courtiers believed George's innocence, and this was of no importance, as he was found guilty of the sentence of incest with the Queen, and also in treason against the King. The sentence of the court was initially that George would be hung, drawn and quartered, but this sentence was later commuted to beheading. He was led to the block along with 4 other men at Tower Hill on the 17th of May 1536. George's speech on the scaffold was extremely long, and he displayed great speaking skills. The large crowd was silent in listening to his last speech, and he touched on his religious beliefs and his passion for reform. He begged for forgiveness for anyone he may have offended, and also begged for God's forgiveness. George also came close to denying his guilt, before calmly giving his neck to the axe. He would be executed 2 days before his sister. A second man accused of treason and adultery with the Queen was Henry Norris, who was the groom of the stall in the Privy Chamber of Henry VIII. He was a close servant of the King, but would support Anne Boleyn a little too much when she fell from favour. During his youth, he became a close friend of Henry, and he would be granted many different offices. Norris is considered by some to be one of Henry's best friends and closest confidants, and he would receive large grants from the King. Henry Norris would also become constable of a number of castles, such as Beaumaris and Wallingford. Following Anne's downfall, Norris would be accused of being solicited by the Queen on a number of different dates. The prosecution's choice of these times and dates was rather just careless and based on nothing but pure fabrication. Henry Norris would outline his innocence during his trial for adultery with the Queen, and he was forced to improvise his defence, with no defence counsel and no advance warning of the evidence being provided. As with George Boleyn, Henry Norris would be found guilty of high treason and adultery, and would be initially sentenced to be hung, drawn and quartered, but this would then be changed to beheading. Unlike the other accused who outlined their innocence on the scaffold before their execution, Norris did not risk any more harsh punishment or treatment by saying anything. He said very little in fear of facing a more brutal death. He faced his execution with relative quiet and was beheaded using the executioner's axe. Elizabeth I would later honour Norris, saying that he died for a noble cause and in the justification of her mother's innocence. William Brereton was the groom of the Privy Chamber to Henry VIII and would serve in this role from 1524. In 1529 he married the daughter of the first Earl of Worcester and would have 2 sons. In reward for his work with the King, Brereton received a number of royal grants in Cheshire in the Welsh Marches, which brought him the valuable sum of more than £10,000 a year. In May 1536, when Anne was accused of adultery, Brereton would be one of these men, being accused of having relations with the Queen. Anne was accused of soliciting him on the 16th of November 1533, and misconduct was said to have taken place on the 27th of November. It is argued that Brereton was added to the plot against Anne to end some of the issues he was causing in the Welsh Marches. He would ultimately be found guilty, of course, and was sentenced to beheading. An eyewitness to the execution would note Brereton's final words before facing the executioner's axe. He said, "The cause whereof I died judge not, but if you judge, judge best," which is said to have been a cautious declaration of his innocence. Mark Smeaton had a rather interesting role within Henry VIII's court. He was a musician at court and was relatively young when he met his end. It's estimated he died at the age of around 23. Smeaton was known to have been a talented singer and was considered a handsome musician and dancer who originally was in Henry's court but transferred then to Anne's. He also played the lute, viola, virginals and organ. After becoming established at court, he was also named a groom of the Privy Chamber. His origins and background were rather lowly though, so he never became involved within the very close circles of the monarchy, but once he was told off by Anne for assuming she would speak to him in the same way as someone from the aristocracy. Mark was ordered by Anne whilst in her chamber at Winchester to play the virginals for her. She spoke at him during this time about why he was so sad that day. This brief conversation would be reported to Thomas Cromwell, who faithfully linked Smeaton to the adultery of the Queen. He was arrested on the 30th of April 1536 and was said to have been tortured with a knotted cord tied around his eyes. On the 1st of May he was sent to the Tower of London, but a pattern was noticed of Smeaton spending large sums of money before his arrest. This was seen as him receiving money from the Queen in return for his services as her lover. Whilst at the Tower, Smeaton was tortured on the rack, and it was during this horrific ordeal that he would admit to being the Queen's lover. The evidence didn't add up for this to be a true claim, but Smeaton would also give his interrogators the name of the 4 other men who would later be executed. He was the only one to admit guilt, and was the only one to be tortured because of his low social standing. His arrest would cause the most controversy with the public, as many were shocked that the Queen would allegedly have an affair with such a lowly person. As he was led to his execution, Smeaton stumbled back from the bloody scaffold. He said, "Masters, I pray you all pray for me, for I have deserved the death." His method of execution, being beheading, was strange, as the usual death for commoners was brutal quartering. Interestingly, following Smeaton's death, Mary I would convince herself that her sister Elizabeth I, who was considered her rival, would have the countenance and face of Smeaton, accusing Anne Boleyn to have actually fathered a daughter with Smeaton, much earlier than the alleged liaisons. Sir Francis Weston was one of the 5 men accused of adultery and high treason. He was a gentleman of the Privy Chamber within Henry's court, and interestingly he's listed as beating the king at bowls, tennis, dice and other games. He was made a gentleman of the Privy Chamber in 1532 and had intimate access to the king. Thomas Cromwell within Anne's court had ordered a number of her ladies to report on the Queen's actions. Anne told one of these ladies how she'd told off Francis Weston for flirting with Madge Shelton, who was betrothed to another courtier, Henry Norris, who we mentioned earlier. Francis would be linked to the plot against Anne and was executed at the age of just 25 after being accused of adultery and also treason against the king. His father is said to have offered all the family had financially in order to gain a pardon for his son. The evidence against Francis, as with all the accused, is rather dubious, and Francis would be beheaded along with the other men on Tower Hill on the 17th of May 1536. So the deaths of George Boleyn, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton and Sir Francis Weston occurred at the hands of a tyrannical plot to bring down Queen Anne Boleyn. These 5 men were linked to the plot and ultimately paid the price with their lives at the hands of an axeman. These 5 men were killed in cold blood and were murdered, being accused of things that were completely unfounded and false at the hands of the bloody King Henry VIII. I hope you found this video interesting. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.